Hi, class. As you know, you're not going to be on Zoom tomorrow. So tomorrow I have my medical procedure, and what you should do is you should look at this podcast, follow along with the lesson that we're going to do today on this podcast. So today, it's not on your syllabus, but today what we're going to do is essentially. I'm going to review Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail with you, the video we watched last week. And I'm going to review some key concepts and key parts of the argument in his essay. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to listen to a short story by James Joyce called Araby. And then we're going to talk about that story, and that'll be it for today. So basically, where you should be at now, I notice a lot of you are still missing some in work for class and papers 1 and 2. I really strongly urge everybody to get caught up before we meet again in person in the Zoom class on week 12 of December 11th. Because remember, we only our class ends on December 18th, so we only have, from today, 3 weeks on to the end of the semester. So if you have trouble, if you're having trouble now getting the assignments in, please believe me, it's better to turn in something than nothing, because then you would most likely fail the class if you can't continue to, if you don't have any grades for me to enter into the grade book. All right, so last week we went over. We listened to the podcast of the letter from a Birmingham jail on YouTube, and what I'd like to cover today are two types of arguments that. Two types of means of reasoning that Martin Luther King uses in order to convey his argument. Okay, so the first form of reasoning is called deductive logic, deductive reasoning. It means to proceed from a general premise, assumption to a specific conclusion, a strict logical form of deductive argument. Is usually formed in a syllogistic way. A syllogism is a basic form of a deductive argument which consists of a major premise. Okay, a major premise is a general statement, all runners are fast. A minor premise is a related specific statement, Joe is a runner. A conclusion is drawn from those premises, therefore Joe is fast. The criterion for a syllogism is that it must be logical to be valid. Now, after I cover these points, I'm going to demonstrate to you where you can find these types of arguments in Martin Luther King's essay. The other type of argument is, the type of reasoning is inductive reasoning. Proceed from an individual observation to a general conclusion, no strict form of an inductive argument hypotheses. First, decide on a question to be answered and its tentative answer. Inference statement of the unknown based on the known. E.g., question, how was the window broken? Evidence, and this is the key part, you need evidence for inductive logic. Ball on the floor, children are playing. Conclusion that you draw from that form of evidence is that child threw the ball through the window. It's a very simple form of inductive logic, which we'll see play out in the Martin Luther King essay. A well-known error is jumping to a conclusion because it amounts to a premature inductive leap. So without enough evidence, and if you jump to a conclusion, you're likely to fall into error in your logic because there's not enough evidence to support your conclusion. Facts are verifiable statements, but inductive conclusions are inferences and opinions. Okay, so we read Martin Luther King's essay, letter from Birmingham jail last week. Martin Luther King asserts in this essay, wherever there is injustice, there is an imperative to push the conflict to a breaking point. He is trying to justify the need for direct nonviolent action. Here, you may see that Martin Luther King is going from a general premise to a specific conclusion. In other words, he's using deductive reasoning. Okay, so further, when he says, when in this paragraph, when I'll read it, moreover, I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of a destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow provincial outsider agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. Can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. So, in this case, the the major premise is, if you can think about this, the major premise is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The minor premise is we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. The major premise, then, is whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. All right, that's the conclusion. Okay, so another thing that you would be helpful to do with the letter from a Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King is to analysis of the audience. Who is he speaking to? To whom is he addressing this argument? Well, if you read carefully, you'll find out that he's addressing the members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is an audience who questions MLK's judgment and they are undermining his decision to proceed with the demonstration in Birmingham. In this first part of the letter, Martin Luther King outlines the steps to nonviolent campaign. And there are 4 basic steps. 1, collection of facts to determine if injustice exists. 2, negotiation. That means to try to find some way to make come to an agreement, or make by trying to find an agreeable arrangement where both sides are coming to a middle ground and find a equitable solution. Self-purification. You might not necessarily know what that means, but I think self-purification in this sense means the nonviolent protester must be aware of all the possible ramifications of his or her nonviolent protest, meaning that the self-purification comes into play when I think what he says that you have to be mindful of the difficulties involved, that you decided to undertake a process of self-purification. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence and repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? So the self-purification means to be aware of all these ramifications of nonviolent protest. Finally, the 4th step is indirect action. Okay? What does indirect action mean in this sense? It means to nonviolently protest. To intervene in a situation which is coming to a crisis point. If you remember, over the summer, the Black Lives Matter movement began as a nonviolent protest, and it maintained its nonviolent status, except there were other contingent forces at work, and that unfortunately steered the whole protest movement away from its original intent. That means nonviolent protest. Okay, so An argumentative question: Why to take direct action? And okay. He provides evidence that brutality exists throughout the many segregated cities in the United States. He urges the reader through substantiation bombing in many cities throughout the U.S. The reason for direct action refutes the possibility of delay. Emotional appeal, stating the position to be argued. The reasoning of the purpose of MLK's plan is to produce a crisis so inevitable that the doors of negotiation will open. 6. Refuting the argument posed in the Birmingham paper by the bishops of the Southern Christian Leadership or Conference, why didn't you give the city enough time to act? Finally, in this section on Martin Luther King, we're going to, the final thing I want to cover is his use of inductive reasoning, which means assembling a gathering of evidence to back up his claim in order to provide a conclusion based on the accumulation of evidence. Inductive reasoning, he states in a series of points that relate why the actions taking place in Birmingham were timely. Okay, let me read you this passage from the letter, which I think is a rather poignant part of the of this letter. One of the most poignant parts of this letter begins here, and I'll read this whole paragraph. Okay, so we have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards gaining political independence. But we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothered in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in, day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Miss. When you are harried by day, haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite for knowing what to expect next, and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. When you are forever fighting a denigrating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, and this is really important here, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying the law, just laws. One has not only legal but moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. So he goes on to say, in the important distinction between the two laws, what do you think is the difference between a man-made law and a law that from God, or a divine law? So he goes on to say that a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in an eternal law and a natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. Okay? So all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. And so on and so on. So, he gives many, many examples of how unjust laws validate the need for breaking those unjust laws because it violates human dignity of the speaker and of his community. So that will be it for the Martin Luther King. I hope you got some more out of that than what you were able to view that from last week. And you can also view. I'll post again the video just in case. After I post this video, I'm going to post also another video to go along with it so that you can view the speech again, to hear it, to listen to it if you want to. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go to, we're going to listen to a podcast on YouTube. And this is changing gears a little bit. We're going to listen to a short story, okay? The short story is by James Joyce, okay? And the story is called Araby. So I'm going to post all that on the Canvas page when we conclude here, and I post this YouTube video, instructional video, on the Canvas page. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to go to Araby, James Joyce, and we're going to listen to it. Okay, for about it's about 13 minutes. We're going to listen to this, and then we're going to briefly talk about it. Okay, so. Here we go.
Araby. North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street, except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. An uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbours in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of decent lives within them, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces. The former tenant of our house, a priest, had died in the back drawing room. Air, musty from having been long enclosed, hung in all the rooms, and the waste room behind the kitchen was littered with old, useless papers. Among these I found a few paper-covered books, the pages of which were curled and damp. The Abbot by Walter Scott, The Devout Communicant, and the Memoirs of Vidocq. I liked the last best because its leaves were yellow. The wild garden behind the house contained a central apple tree and a few straggling bushes, under one of which I found the late tenant's rusty bicycle pump. He had been a very charitable priest. In his will, he had left all his money to institutions, and the furniture of his house to his sister. When the short days of winter came, dusk fell before we had well eaten our dinners. When we met in the street, the houses had grown sombre. The space of sky above us was the colour of ever-changing violet, and towards it the lamps of the street lifted their feeble lanterns. The cold air stung us, and we played till our bodies glowed. Our shouts echoed in the silent street. The career of our play brought us through the dark muddy lanes behind the houses, where we ran the gauntlet of the rough tribes from the cottages, to the back doors of the dark dripping gardens where odours arose from the ash pits, to the dark odorous stables where the coachman smoothed and combed the horse, or shook music from the buckled harness. When we returned to the street, light from the kitchen windows had filled the areas. If my uncle was seen turning the corner, we hid in the shadow until we had seen him safely housed. or if Mangan's sister came out on the doorstep to call her brother into his tea. We watched her from our shadow peer up and down the street. We waited to see whether she would remain or go in, and if she remained, we left our shadow and walked up to Mangan's steps resignedly. She was waiting for us, her figure defined by the light from the half-open door. Her brother always teased her before he obeyed, and I stood by the railings looking at her. Her dress swung as she moved her body, and the soft rope of her hair tossed from side to side. Every morning I lay on the floor in the front parlour watching her door. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash, so that I could not be seen. When she came out on the doorstep, my heart leaped. I ran to the hall, seized my books, and followed her. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I never spoken to her, except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. Her image accompanied me even in places the most hostile to romance. On Saturday evenings, when my aunt went marketing, I had to go to carry some of the parcels. We walked through the flaring streets, jostled by drunken men and bargaining women, amid the curses of labourers, the shrill litanies of shop boys who stood on guard by the barrels of pigs' cheeks, the nasal chanting of street singers who sang a camalia about O'Donovan Rossa, or a ballad about the troubles in our native land. These noises converged in a single sensation of life for me. I imagined that I bore my chalice safely through a throng of foes. Her name sprang to my lips at moments in strange prayers and praises, which I myself did not understand. My eyes were often full of tears, I could not tell why, and at times a flood from my heart seemed to pour itself out into my bosom. I thought little of the future. I did not know whether I would ever speak to her or not, or if I spoke to her, how I could tell her of my confused adoration. But my body was like a harp, and her words and gestures were like fingers running upon the wires. One evening I went into the back drawing room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. Through one of the broken panes I heard the rain impinge upon the earth, the fine incessant needles of water playing in the sodden beds. Some distant lamp or lighted window gleamed below me. I was thankful that I could see so little. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until they trembled, murmuring, oh love," many times. At last she spoke to me. When she addressed the first words to me, I was so confused that I did not know what to answer. She asked me was I going to Araby. I forgot whether I answered yes or no. It would be a splendid bazaar, she said. She would love to go. And why can't you? I asked. While she spoke, she turned a silver bracelet round and round her wrist. She could not go, she said, because there would be a retreat that week in our convent. Her brother and two other boys were fighting for their caps, and I was alone at the railings. She held one of the spikes, bowing her head towards me. The light from the lamp opposite our door caught the white curve of her neck, lit up her hair that rested there, and falling, lit up the hand upon the railing. It fell over one side of her dress and caught the white border of a petticoat, just visible as she stood at ease. "It's well for you," she said. "If I go," I said, "I will bring you something." What innumerable follies laid waste to my waking and sleeping thoughts after that evening. I wished to annihilate the tedious intervening days. I chafed against the work of school. At night in my bedroom and by day in the classroom, her image came between me and the page I strove to read. The syllables of the word Araby were called to me through the silence in which my soul luxuriated and cast an Eastern enchantment over me. I asked for leave to go to the bazaar on Saturday night. My aunt was surprised and hoped it was not some Freemason affair. I answered few questions in class. I watched my master's face pass from amiability to sternness. He hoped I was not beginning to idle. I could not call my wandering thoughts together. I had hardly any patience with the serious work of life, which, now that it stood between me and my desire, seemed to me child's play. Ugly, monotonous child's play. On Saturday morning I reminded my uncle that I wished to go to the bazaar in the evening. He was fussing at the hall stand looking for the hat brush and answered me curtly, "Yes, boy, I know." As he was in the hall, I could not go into the front parlour and lie at the window. I left the house in bad humour and walked slowly towards the school. The air was pitilessly raw, and already my heart misgave me. When I came home to dinner, my uncle had not yet been home. Still, it was early. I sat staring at the clock for some time, and when its ticking began to irritate me, I left the room. I mounted the staircase and gained the upper part of the house. The high, cold, empty, gloomy rooms liberated me, and I went from room to room singing. From the front window I saw my companions playing below in the street. Their cries reached me weakened and indistinct, and leaning my forehead against the cool glass, I looked over at the dark house where she lived. I may have stood there for an hour, seeing nothing but the brown-clad figure cast by my imagination, touched discreetly by the lamplight at the curved neck, at the hand upon the railings, and at the border below the dress. When I came downstairs again, I found Mrs. Mercer sitting at the fire. She was an old, garrulous woman, a pawnbroker's widow, who collected used stamps for some pious purpose. I had to endure the gossip of the tea-table. The meal was prolonged beyond an hour, and still my uncle did not come. Mrs. Mercer stood up to go. She was sorry she couldn't wait any longer, but it was after 8 o'clock, and she did not like to be out late, as the night air was bad for her. When she had gone, I began to walk up and down the room, clenching my fists. My aunt said, "I'm afraid you may have to put off your bazaar for this night of our Lord." At 9 o'clock I heard my uncle's latch key in the hall door. I heard him talking to himself, and heard the hall stand rocking when it had received the weight of his overcoat. I could interpret these signs. When he was midway through his dinner, I asked him to give me the money to go to the bazaar. He had forgotten. "The people are in bed, and after their first sleep now," he said. I did not smile. My aunt said to him energetically, "Can't you give him the money and let him go? You've kept him late enough as it is." My uncle said he was very sorry he had forgotten. He said he believed in the old saying, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." He asked me where I was going, and when I had told him a second time, he asked me did I know the Arab's farewell to his steed. When I left the kitchen, he was about to recite the opening lines of the piece to my aunt. I held a florin tightly in my hand as I strode down Buckingham Street towards the station. The sight of the streets thronged with buyers and glaring with gas recalled to me the purpose of my journey. I took my seat in a third-class carriage of a deserted train. After an intolerable delay, the train moved out of the station slowly. It crept onward among ruinous houses and over the twinkling river. At Westland Row Station, a crowd of people pressed to the carriage doors, but the porters moved them back, saying that it was a special train for the bazaar. I remained alone in the bare carriage. In a few minutes, the train drew up beside an impoverished wooden platform. I passed out onto the road and saw by the lighted dial of a clock that it was 10 minutes to 10. In front of me was a large building which displayed the magical name. I could not find any sixpenny entrance, and fearing that the bazaar would be closed, I passed in quickly through a turnstile, handing a shilling to a weary-looking man. I found myself in a big hall, girdled at half its height by a gallery. Nearly all the stalls were closed, and a greater part of the hall was in darkness. I recognised a silence like that which pervades a church after a service. I walked into the centre of the bazaar timidly. A few people were gathered about the stalls which were still open. Before a curtain, over which the words Café Chanton were written in coloured lamps, 2 men were counting money on a salver. I listened to the fall of the coins. Remembering with difficulty why I had come, I went over to one of the stalls and examined porcelain vases and flowered tea sets. At the door of the stall, a young lady was talking and laughing with 2 young gentlemen. I remarked their English accents and listened vaguely to their conversation. "Oh, I never said such a thing." "Oh, but you did." "Oh, I didn't." "Didn't she say that?" Yes, I heard her. Oh, there's a fib. Observing me, the young lady came over and asked me did I wish to buy anything. The tone of her voice was not encouraging. She seemed to have spoken to me out of a sense of duty. I looked humbly at the great jars that stood like Eastern guards at either side of the dark entrance to the stall and murmured, "No, thank you." The young lady changed the position of one of the vases and went back to the two young men. They began to talk of the same subject. Once or twice the young lady glanced at me over her shoulder. I lingered before her stall, though I knew my stay was useless, to make my interest in her wares seem the more real. Then I turned away slowly and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed the 2 pennies to fall against the 6pence in my pocket. I heard a voice call from one end of the gallery that the light was out. The upper part of the hall was now completely dark. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger.
Okay. So that was James Joyce's Araby. Your assignment for today, after having listened to this, is I'm going to post questions on meaning and questions for discussion for you to answer. I will have this posted on Canvas on the same link, the assignment link, and you'll find it there. So you want to do questions on meaning 1 through 6 and questions on for discussion 1 through 4, okay? And then you want to email those to me for credit, for class credit. So one of the things I'm going to do before we end class, the Zoom class, this podcast for today, is I'm going to read you a little bit of the biographical note of James Joyce, who you may or may not be familiar with. James Joyce was born in 1882. He lived to 1941. He was born in Dublin and raised a Roman Catholic. He attended University College, Dublin, where he began writing plays and poems, and was an avid student of classics and modern languages. He later moved to Paris for 1 year, working as a teacher and a journalist before moving to Ireland, where he met Nora Barnacle. The couple moved to Europe, remaining together until the author's death, but not formally marrying until 1931. Committed to a writing career, Joyce published Dubliners in 1914. In this collection, he emerged as an important pioneer of the modern short story, which dealt with the common experience of daily living but rendered them extraordinary through the use of epiphany. An epiphany, a term he borrows from Catholicism, which involves a character experiencing an intense revelation through an ordinary event. Residing for most of his life in Paris, among many of the European modernists, he is now considered one of the most important writers of the 20th century, publishing Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake. In their use of a modernist narrative technique known as stream of consciousness, the latter 2 works are highly experimental, exerting a strong influence on subsequent writers. Taken from Dubliners, the following story deals with a young man's experience of disillusionment and demonstrates the author's use of epiphany. So this story Araby is in a short story collection called Dubliners, and it exemplifies a type of story that James Joyce was to master his. But I'm going to give you about 6 terms here that we, when we talk about short stories, we tend to look at these 5 terms rather. Those 5 terms are setting, character, theme, conflict, and mood. So the first thing we're going to talk about is setting. From having listened to the story, you have to really imagine what the setting is. You have to, when you think about the setting, what country are we? Is this story taking place? What city is it taking place? And what part of the city is it taking place? And from the descriptions that Joyce gives the reader, what is the manner in which he describes the setting? He does this really well by giving us information in the first sentence. North Richmond Street being blind, meaning a blind alley, was a quiet street except at the hour when the Christian Brothers schools set the boys free. An uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of decent lives within them, gaze at one another with brown, imperturbable faces. Now, the second term we're going to use is character. And think about the character. That's one thing that fiction is primarily distinguishes fiction from other types of prose and poetry in particular, is the use of character. So think about the characters that are primarily and the sub character. So you have main character is we don't know his name, but he's a boy of maybe 12 or 13. You have to think about who he is and how old he is and what kind of boy he is. The other characters are the girl in question, Magnan's sister, who is a playmate. Magnan is a playmate of the main character, and his sister is the object of his adoration. And the other characters in this short story are the uncle, his uncle, and his aunt, who are presumably taking care of him or caretaking him at the moment, who are his primary caretakers. And the other characters are less distinct, but they are at the end of the story. The two women at the bazaar, at Araby Bazaar, were having this conversation, this random sort of middle of a conversation kind of thing at the end. Okay. The other thing I'd like you to think about is the type of character. In fiction, there are two types of characters. There's a round character, and then there's a flat character. A round character is a character that has more complexity. It's more, and the character is more drawn out. Has more, primarily and most importantly, the ability to change at the end of the story. The other characters are more flat, and they're more flatly drawn, and that they don't represent anything more than sort of sketches or kind of like images of characters that don't necessarily change, but they're not as complex as the main character. Such characters are the Magnan's sister, who we barely get a glimpse of in the beginning, and also the aunt and the uncle, and of course the two women at the end. The other thing is theme. When we think about the theme, a theme is what is the underlying kind of motif of the story? What is it? A young infatuation, and or the perhaps the epiphany being at the end? The epiphany being the heightened awareness of how foolish his infatuation is in comparison to the reality is that his Magnan sister is probably not in any way infatuated with him, and he's just kind of let his fancy get away with him. He's let his imagination get away with him. You know what that means, and when you let your your imagination get away, you kind of create all these ideas that aren't necessarily reality. So conflict. Conflict is conflict between a character or character. There are many types of conflict. The first type of conflict is man against nature, and meaning that there's a conflict between nature and man, which we saw in Emerson in particular, that kind of a person against taking on nature as a kind of object. And then there's man against man, which is a man pitted against his fellow man, and then man against self, which is essentially what this is about. It's about a boy in conflict with himself. He doesn't know yet how to handle the relationship between reality and his imagination as much at this young age. So there's a conflict between him and his desires, his imagination, his need to create and imagine a more fanciful a version of reality that's not necessarily doesn't square necessarily with the actual reality of his life and his environment. And the mood is its primary feeling. What kind of feeling do you get from this piece? Do you get a kind of the feeling of it's being late in the fall? It's kind of like November. It gets dark out. It's kind of nippy out. It's cold. it's kind of raw out, and there's also a mood of enchantment, I think, as well, at the end, with the story leading you on to this bazaar, which is sort of mystical and sort of not really real or exotic. All right, so these five characteristics of a short story. Any short story you ever read will have some elements of these five characteristics. Okay, so that ends class for today. And I will post everything up on the website for you to view, including the questions that you need to answer. So I will look forward to seeing you next week on the 11th of December. Okay? Have a good day.